what I'll do is just go through the list of everybody here and invite you to talk for a few minutes about your book. I'm sorry, we have to sort of be a bit tight on time because there are quite a lot of people here. So to aid in that, Keith has a timer. Where will it appear, Keith?
We've actually removed the timer. I can still add it back if you like, but people can just try to keep to 3 minutes.
I think
that still allows some time for you to follow up if you wish. Yeah.
No, I think that's great. Hard to concentrate when you're faced with time ticking away.
Yeah, I still.
So thanks. Why Deanne, should we go to you for a start? I think Deanne is there. You are.
I guess you're going in alphabetical order.
Yes.
Would it be okay if I shared my screen to show the cover of the book?
Sure, go ahead.
Let's see if I can make this work. So this book was in the making for about a decade. So it's on, as the title says here, Sample Introduction System for Inductively Coupled Plasma Mass Spectrometry and Optical Emission Spectrometry. So the inductively coupled plasma, of which you have a picture here, is a very, very versatile source of both emission and mass spectrometry, and different ways of introducing the sample in the plasma will be useful in different ways. So for forensic analysis, risk assessment of food safety, characterization of materials. And so this book, talks about the different ways to introduce the sample and do analysis and gives applications. It has 9 chapters, 5 of which were contributed by my group. So I had PhD students write some chapters and co-author them with me, and so it was nice for them. It served as the introduction for their thesis and gave them the experience of contributing to a book. So I'm very pleased with the product. I don't think I'll do that again. It was a lot of work, especially finding authors to contribute the other 4 chapters and getting them to deliver on time. One in particular was worse than pulling a tooth, but now I'm glad it's finally over, and everyone can enjoy that. And so I'm sharing my book, of course, with all my students. They can use it as their Bible. So I think that's about all I want to say. I want to thank the students who contributed and all the authors, because without them, this book would not have been possible. Hopefully there won't be another edition in 10 years. Thank you.
Thanks, Deanne. Better to avoid the pulling teeth experience too often. Can I ask you, I'm interested, if anybody's got any questions for Deanne, please just indicate. So I wanted to ask Deanne, so I noticed Elsevier is your publisher. Is this book a book you took to them with the proposal that they publish it, or was it done in a sense the initiative taken from their side?
It was from their side. Actually, there was a previous edition of this book, a narrower topic just on mass spectrometry. Yeah. So they approached me because they said, your book is over 10 years old. It's time to have something else. And so we decided to broaden the scope to make it more interesting to a broader audience.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thanks, Deanne. Any questions for Deanne? I'm out of my depth on the subject, but congratulations.
Thank you.
Why don't we go to Karen Bowes?
Okay, hi there. My name's Karen Bowes. I teach at the Faculty of Education, and this is the cover of my book. It's called Ready to Learn, Self-Regulation in the Kindergarten Classroom. Self-regulation, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about what led me to write the book. Self-regulation involves being able to control your emotions, your behavior, and your cognition. And parents and educators of young children know intuitively that it's important for young children to develop self-regulatory skills because they see firsthand how that impacts their learning. Well, however, there is some confusion about how best to promote these skills. So my goal was to bridge research and practice in order to better understand this question. So I worked with 12 early years educators over the course of 7 months, and it was a collaborative inquiry professional learning model. Our aim was to explore characteristics of classrooms and pedagogical practices that would provide children with opportunities to practice the executive function skills that are the building blocks of self-regulation in young children, which are inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So the book grew out of this collaborative process. So we were uncovering links between theoretical frameworks, empirical studies, and everyday classroom experiences. They looked at their teaching practices and they reflected on activities that would fit in these models. And they basically, we came up with a compilation of activities that we put together in the book. But there was another component. Besides providing opportunities for young children to practice these self-regulatory skills, and the activities are developmentally appropriate and engaging. They were drama, music, dance, literacy. But we also were intent on helping children growing self-awareness so that they could learn to monitor and process these skills as well, identifying and sharing and implementing their strategies. So this book allows early years educators and parents of young children to examine a wide variety of activities within the framework that focuses on self-regulation. The connections between the activities and executive function processes are highlighted throughout the book. So the book could be viewed as a toolkit to help develop self-regulatory skills in young children because it has real-world examples, it has simple games and activities, it has the directions, and it has lovely clarifying pictures. But it's also intended to encourage educators and parents to interpret how young children self-regulate with a new understanding, with an understanding that's focused on executive function. So once educators and parents see the connections with these processes in the book, they can begin to see these connections within a self-regulatory lens in their daily activities and their other interactions with young children.
Well, thanks, Karen. How interesting. I keep, as you were talking, I was thinking, what an important book in the present context when kids are learning so much out of the classroom, right? And presumably the cultivation of those self-regulatory skills, when the classroom experience is interrupted and altered as it has been, it's going to be very challenging.
Very challenging indeed, yes. Yeah.
Oh, very, 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 very interesting. Any questions for Karen?
I have a question.
I've seen on, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, Colleen, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Karen. How fascinating. I was just wondering, it just seemed to me, I have 2 young children at home during the pandemic, and I can imagine lots of parents would be really interested in all of this, as well as teachers, probably more than you may have expected in, the writing, even the writing phase of, of the book.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
great.
sure. Yeah. And it really does, because I think the strength of this book is the link of research and practice. To see what this looks like, because parents have this understanding of self-regulation that really is very vague, and to actually see, oh, this is my child, ways that I can support them with their cognitive flexibility and how that helps them to self-regulate. Like, it really does give you a new lens to look at it. And I know that the teachers involved, they said, I look at everything I do differently now because I see it differently within the executive function processes. So, and some of them said, I wish I'd had this 20 years ago.
Yeah. Interesting. Lola.
Yeah, I've seen on the dreadful social media, Facebook, a number of instances, and they're supposed to be sort of teaching a child self-regulatory control, where the child is left in a kitchen or a room with a cookie and the parent goes away for some time. I wonder what you... And it's supposed to be so cute. And I think it's kind of dreadful.
No.
Does it teach anything?
That's not the point of where I'm coming from. That's like
Oh, I can see that.
yeah. And my point is that, I mean, the activities are drama, music, dance, and literacy. Like it's all things that children should be engaging in.
Yeah.
And I found that if you have this underlying understanding of self-regulation, sometimes you just tweak the activity slightly and you actually see now you're actually focusing on executive function skills because you just changed the activity slightly. That made them have to maybe use more inhibitory control, or maybe they had to somehow use more strategies to use cognitive flexibility, to use more strategy use. So it's hard to, I'd love to go through a lot of the activities and explain how these processes are highlighted, but that would take a lot more than 3 minutes. As the book does make it very clear how these processes can be demonstrated and fostered with young children.
Who is your publisher?
It's Wintergreen.
Wintergreen.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Karen. So why don't we stay in the Faculty of Education? We'll go to Rosa.
Okay, I will share my screen. 1 second. It's okay? Can you see? No.
Yep.
No, you see the what do you see? Oh, 1 second. Can you see Rosa Bruno Joffrey? I saw something different. Well, okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have 2 books, copyright for 2 books in 2020. One of them I introduced last year because it came out a few months earlier. Then I will only mention it. And this is an authored book, University of Toronto Press, where I usually publish a history series published with the help of the grant from the Federation for the Humanities. Is a product of an insight. And this is the book. It's entitled The Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions, From Ultramontane Origins to a New Cosmology. And I discussed it last time. I will go quickly to the second book, 2020. It's a co-authored book. It is co-authored with Joseph Stafford, who was my doctoral student, but this book has nothing to do with his thesis. And we were asked to write something about teacher education in Canada, teacher preparation in Canada, in particular, very comprehensive synthetic study. And this is the Peripatetic Journey of Teacher Preparation in Canada, published by Emerald Studies in Teacher Preparation and National and Global Context Series, is UK, and so on. And the preface is by historian Ruth Sangwell. This is a book, and please notice that the painting, I love art, as some of you know, and the painting is, in fact, the cover is a silk print from Angela Solar, a member of our faculty. Then the Peripatetic Journey provides a comprehensive, not exhaustive, there is a title, historical synthesis of teacher preparation in Canada. We took a longue durée approach, and as the book begins with traditional practices and the role of the community as an educator in indigenous nations encountered by the colonizers. The book traces teacher preparation all the way through colonization, the formation of the educational state, the development of educational sciences and debates about education, as well as the professionalization of teaching, its feminization, particularly at the elementary level, and its integration into the university, along with changes that emerged out of the long 1960s. The book closes with a discussion on indigenous people reclaiming control over their education and with it, their spirituality, as well as gaining control over the formation of their own teachers. The historical analysis is placed within the prevailing political and socioeconomic processes in relation to overlapping discourses and international configurations of ideas. The book is divided into 6 chapters, of which Stafford wrote the first 3. We made the decision to keep developments in Quebec from 1840 to 1975 in a separate chapter written by Stafford. to maintain continuity in the narrative, given the province's unique characteristics. These are the chapters by Stafford, one from a social and emotional educational process to missionary conversion and schooling from the 1600s to the fall of New France. Chapter 2, teacher preparation in British North America before the establishment of normal schools, 1763 to 1840, and chapter 3, teacher preparation in French Quebec, 1841-1975. Then chapters 4, 5, and 6 are mine, the creation of the educational state, the normal school, and the formation of a polity in the emerging age of empire, 1841-1918. Chapter 5 is teacher preparation in English Canada in the interwar period, 1918-1945, and chapter 6, shaking teacher preparation / education, the post-war in the long 1960s. These chapters, as you can see, are devoted to teacher preparation in English-speaking Canada. And I following Zool, I hope I pronounce it properly, tries to transcend the antinomy of social and cultural history to interpret structures while dealing with culture, contingency, and agency. There is a great deal of intersectional analysis. As you can imagine, I found lots of racist elements in the analysis of the textbooks and the textbooks for future teachers. The leading line of thought in this part of the book places teacher preparation at the nexus of international and political forces, intellectual changes, religious forces, and regional context. The author does not separate the self and the world, whether it be the teacher and student, the Catholic school and public school, or the colonizer and the colonized. Final note, the book closes in the mid-1970s when education became strongly influenced by neoliberal policies. Its writing was partly carried out during the 2020's pandemic crisis, and the global situation set an invitation to think of the crisis of neoliberalism and of a less individualist pedagogy that could be developed within the parameters of the social geography generated by new technologies. I actually did the editing in a hotel room in Chile in March 2020 while trying to come back to Canada as soon as possible. The rest of the pandemic, apart from teaching a full load, I devoted to a book on Ivan Illich that has been approved recently by University of Toronto Press, and I hope it will be out early in 2022. That's all.
Thanks, Rosa. Wonderful to have that last detail of where you did the editing. We very rarely get that kind of insight into the origins of the book.
Well, I remember because I was desperate to come. It was really bad. Yeah.
Very good. Any questions for Rosa? Perhaps you could unshare your screen, Rosa, so we can see everybody. There we go. Any questions? I'm assuming, although the residential schools are an important chapter in educational history in this country, it's not so much about teacher preparation. Does the narrative of the book intersect?
Yeah, both books deals with residential schools because, as you know, indigenous schooling, and prison has to do was at the federal level, while education is a provincial matter in Canada. And yes, I refer to that in various parts of the book. Also, in dealing with the RNDM, they had a brief moment. It's only 17 months or so in residential schools, but I really touched that as well. And what caught my attention was this preoccupation with child-centered education while emptying the self. They had to empty the self to make them something else, not what they were. It was dramatic, yeah.
Thanks, Rosa. Any other questions?
I have my hand up.
Yeah, Deanne, sorry. I didn't see it. Sorry. Go ahead.
I'm curious, being from La Belle Province, I'm curious, could you give examples of what's common between Quebec and the rest of Canada and not common aside from language?
I could not hear you at all. Very bad.
Okay, let me scream.
I heard Quebec and I heard, that's another, the only word I heard.
So what an example of what is common between Quebec and the rest of Canada and what is different aside from language?
I think it was very different in terms of structure. I am not an expert in Quebec, and we indicate that in the book, and in particular in the part of Stafford, and it has to do with the preparation of teachers. It has some elements in common, but it has to do with the structure of education and the role of the Catholic Church in that. There is a part here that has to do with that. But it is quite different. It is quite different. It's not only the language, it's the structure, it's the role of the Catholic Church that actually played practically the role of a Department of Education, and this tainted everything.
Thanks, Rosa. So I think we'll move on then. If we could go to Jeffrey Collins from History. Jeffrey.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for coming to share their work. As the parent of 3 kids in online schooling, I'm sort of tempted to let these School of Education people go on a bit longer, but we'll move on to history. So my book, published last year, is with Cambridge, is entitled "In the Shadow of Leviathan: John Locke and the Politics of Conscience." This is the cover. I should have.
I love that. Yeah, I know.
Okay.
The cover is a portrait of Locke that was done in his final year, 1704. And he's rather informally sitting in his study with his folios. You probably can't see this on the computer, but his folios behind him. And I like to imagine, this is why I chose the image, that Hobbes's Leviathan, the great masterpiece of Thomas Hobbes, is among those books, because Locke certainly owned a folio edition of Hobbes's Leviathan. And that's the subject of the book. The subject of the book, my first book was on Thomas Hobbes, and the subject of this book is Locke's understanding of Hobbes, or Locke's reading of Hobbes. Locke and Hobbes were contemporaries for nearly 40 years, even though Hobbes was born in 1588 and Locke died in 1704. So they had this enormous, Hobbes lived to be 91, so they had this very long joint lifespan, but they were contemporaries for 40 years. And for about 10 years, they were neighbors on the Strand, where they lived with their titled patrons. And of course, they're the 2 most famous Anglophone political theorists, 2 of the most famous political theorists in the Western tradition. And their political theories have a lot of structural similarities. The state of nature, the social contract device, natural rights, so on and so forth. So there's always been a sort of interest in their relationship as kind of canonical thinkers. They're often juxtaposed together on university syllabi, particularly by political theorists. But historians have for many decades kind of kept the question at arm's length, because it smacks a little bit of canon formation. And the 2 of them sit together on the canon. That's how political theorists think. We historians know better. So the historical question has been sort of neglected, actually. And so this is really the first book-length attempt to get to the bottom of how Locke understood Hobbes. Hobbes would not have read any of Locke. He died before Locke had published anything consequential. But Hobbes was a notorious, famous figure throughout Locke's life. And as I say, they were in very similar circles, and they lived near each other, and their political theories were rather similar. So what I've done is try to take an historian's approach to the question, rather than just juxtaposing their political theories, their classics, the 2 treatises of government on the one hand and Leviathan on the other, and saying, well, how are these similar? I've tried to dig into the archives and really kind of get to the question of where might they have met? Who might they have known in common? And largely this involved a lot of work in Locke's massive archive. His reading notes, his commonplace books, his correspondence, the correspondence of his associates, but also work in his library. He left his entire library intact, so we know exactly what he read and what he owned. and when he bought he was a kind of pack rat. So we know when he bought books and what he paid for them and so forth. So you can really reconstruct Locke's view of Hobbes and how he read him, when he read him, and how it influenced his own thinking. So it's an historian's attempt to get to the bottom of this question. It's a very biographical book, and there's a lot about the political context that they shared and that influenced them. And the basic argument, I won't say too much about it because it's a complicated argument, but the basic argument is that we tend to think of them as being theorists of the state. One sort of a liberal, the other sort of an absolutist. But in point of fact, we really have to understand Locke as engaged by Hobbes's religious writing. I mean, he was obsessed with Hobbes's theology, his understanding of the church, and particularly his understanding of conscience and toleration. And so what emerges in the book is really a new reading of how Locke's understanding of toleration developed during decades of his life in dialogue with Hobbes. So Hobbes influenced him at various critical moments of his own evolution as a theorist of toleration. So the book is, as the subtitle suggests, John Locke and the Politics of Conscience, is really about that question and the quality of Hobbes and Locke as theorists of conscience and toleration and religious government and the relationship of church and state. And a final theme of the book is to take that question and to interrogate how the liberal tradition has understood Hobbes and Locke over centuries. They're both understood in some sense as kind of fonts of liberalism or liberal political thinking, kind of a bit of an anachronistic way to think of them, but nonetheless a kind of powerful one. And so I sort of reinterpret their position in the canon of liberal thought by using this question of toleration, conscience, and their two views on that as a way of interpreting them in situ, in their own context. So that's the book.
Congratulations! It sounds wonderful. Can you talk a bit about the archive, Jeffrey? So are Locke's papers all in one place, or are they spread around?
Yeah, well, Locke's papers are all at the Boston Library in Locke. Yeah, and I mean, he left a massive. I mean, Hobbes left about 300 letters to and from. He burned most of his letters. Locke left 5,000. And he left reading diaries from every year of his life. So I did a lot of work in the Bodleian, but I also worked a lot at Kew at the National Archive there because his patron, the Earl of Shaftesbury, was an important figure too for Locke papers, and his papers are at the National Archive. And then there's scattered pieces at Harvard and so forth. So some of his manuscripts have been scattered to the four corners, but his major archive is at Oxford. Yeah, so, and it's huge, and the handwriting's miserable. So it was quite a hunt.
Amazing work. Any questions for Jeffrey?
Is that
can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Ram, go ahead.
Yeah. So isn't John Locke the one that started this idea of tabula rasa?
Well, sure. I mean, so Locke is a bit of he operates in different contexts, and he's probably most famous in the history of philosophy as an epistemologist and to speak anachronistically, an empiricist, right? And a theorist of education, of course, as the education people will know. And yes, the blank slate is in some sense one of the most influential ideas he had in terms of his influence over the Enlightenment. But he's also known as a kind of contractual political theorist and as a theorist of toleration, and a lot, he wore a lot of hats. And the philosophy doesn't always hang together perfectly well, to be honest. So he tended to operate in different contexts.
In your research, did you come across how he came across this idea?
Not particularly. There's quite a bit of writing on that, and writing on, for instance, his reading of scholarship on his reading of Descartes and the rationalist tradition in France, and how he moves towards a more empiricist. And there is some people claim that he got some of that from Hobbes, because Hobbes himself had a kind of empirical sensory bent into how he understood knowledge. But that wasn't my specific topic, and in fact, I didn't find any evidence of Locke reading Hobbes as an epistemologist. He didn't seem to be that interested in those dimensions of Hobbes's thinking. So he read Descartes and Spinoza. There's quite a bit of work on how his own understanding of knowledge developed. But what I found on the question of Hobbes and Locke was that it was much more oriented around conscience and religious questions and that kind of inner knowing rather than epistemology proper.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
All right, why don't we move on to Lola? Oh, by the way, before we go there, Jeffrey, I should say, archival work is just fascinating. One of the high points of my career was to find, when going through the Vera Brittain archive, her collection of autumn leaves she picked up during the Blitz and tucked into the pages of her diary. And it was such a powerful sense of the lived life comes through from those sorts of accidental discoveries, right? Yeah, it's great. Thanks. Lola, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lola Cuddy. I am Professor Emerita at the Department of Psychology. And I don't know if you can see it, but this is the book. Music and the Aging Brain, where I was the primary co-editor with my colleagues from University of Montreal, Sylvie Belvy and Aline Moussad. It's published by Elsevier. And it has 28 authors for 16 chapters. They're international authors that I've personally been in touch with. And I know what Diane means, collecting them all together like herding cats, but we pulled it all together eventually. For music, for most people, even if they're not musicians, music is a very powerful influence in their lives. And if that's not true of you, you're being studied anyway under musical ahedonia, but it's not part of the book. Around us in the home. If you have kids, there's TV, there's iPhones, there's choirs, and, dare I say it, music lessons. But for older adults, perhaps whether or not they succeeded at the music lessons, they still encounter music regularly in social and cultural contexts, such as group singing, concerts, rituals, and dances. Music is sought out for pleasure, relaxation, anxiety reduction, which is part of emotion regulation, and reminiscence. Music is a great stimulator of memories. They're playing our song, dear, that kind of thing. Are there any benefits, though, from all this activity? Are there any benefits for older adults? It's possible that there is. The early Greeks talked of such benefits, and the world of anecdotes is full of stories about benefits. But the question we were asking in this book is there any scientific evidence for this? Evidence that would promote future activity and directions in research. Our book explores and evaluates the available scientific evidence, and in doing so is meant to be a guide to promote future research. Why is this important? Why should we care? Reflect that worldwide we are an aging population. Almost 10% of people worldwide are over 65, a percentage projected to reach 17% by 2050. Such increases will inevitably be accompanied by the incidence and prevalence of aging neuropathology. Moreover, with the dementias, especially Alzheimer's disease, there's no known cure. So these folk present heavy economic and moral challenges to provide resources directed to the physical, mental, and social welfare of older generations. So we're asking, how can we allay the physical and cognitive effects of aging so that older individuals maintain good health and independence? Can we do this through music? Can it be one of the activities that will foster this? If so, we can intervene with the growing cost of healthcare needs with low-cost, easily acceptable alternatives. We can alleviate the pain, distress, and social isolation of incapacitated individuals. And there may be reciprocal perks. I mean, we can learn more about brain function in this way. Now, the book chapters follow 3 sections. The first section is the musical structure of the brain, where we talk about the musical structure of the brain for normal adults and for abnormal aging and pathology. In the second part, we look at music as neuroprotective, and in the third part, we look at music theory and music therapy in pathological aging. In the musical brain chapters, we deal with a description of the musical brain and the effects of normal aging on music perception and cognition. The neuroarchitecture of brain organization for music is shown to comprise complex interconnected processes. I have many diagrams on that stuff and structures, from simple visceral responses to music, sort of gut responses to sound, to a higher order featured extraction, and then at the cortical level, memory, pattern, and emotion. In these chapters, we look at sensory losses in normal aging and note that experience and knowledge can fill in some of the gaps where sensory loss occurs. We then look at pathological aging and note the devastating cognitive losses resulting from brain damage following stroke and dementia. Neurodegenerative disease may selectively target the hierarchical, organized, distributed networks of the musical brain. This is a gloomy prospect and it's serious, but then we go to an interlude where we looked at a series of historical evidence for a series of composers who nonetheless, over 600 years, well, we started in the 1400s and moved to today, who nevertheless continued to be musically active and productive almost right up to their death. Although it's very difficult to determine an exact and appropriate diagnosis from historical evidence of their pathology, these cases stand as encouragement that future research into these cases of musical function might move to neuroprotective and therapeutic uses of music. Now, in the second section, we cover chapters on music and neuroprotection and evaluate the proposal that music can help the brain from alleviating or preventing even, or delaying the effects of normal and pathological aging. Such activities are choir participation, movement with dancing and music lessons, and they may be effective in forestalling cognitive decline. One theory is that a form of neural or cognitive reserve is built up that would delay the expression of brain pathology. Then in the final section, we have chapters that cover music therapy and intervention and evaluate the proposal that music could alleviate the symptoms of disease. I think the most successful form of therapy here is neurological music therapy. It's a newer form, NMT, and it addresses such ailments as loss of movement or loss of speech following stroke. NMT researchers study neural mechanisms of rhythm and music, and they use these understandings of the mechanisms that are failing to develop clinical devices for use with patients. It also explores memory training through music for dementia patients. And the end result of the reviews are that it's a very promising avenue to follow. Now, we don't have final answers, but we can say that there are definitely possibilities following up here. I mentioned that we had we were honored to be nominated for the 2021 Prose Award from the American Publishers Association. We didn't win, we lost out to a history of ancient Mayan history, which I guess is pretty against, difficult to compete with. But anyway, we were very happy for that nomination. And I'd like to mention that for the early stages of the research that got me going on this field and from which the book became developed, I'd like to thank Dr. Jackie Duffin in the History of Medicine and the late Angie Garcia of the Queen's Memory Clinic, both very helpful ladies. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Lola. Any questions for Lola? I'm always ready to jump in with one, but I don't want to preempt anybody else if they have a question. I'll ask mine.
Rosa seems to have a question.
Oh, Rosa, go ahead. Sorry, why am I not seeing Rosa here? Okay, go ahead, Rosa.
Yes.
Speakers, mic's off.
Oh, yeah, you're on mute, Rosa.
Unmute. Okay, now?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Lola, thank you for such wonderful book. I will buy it for sure. I buy only history and political theory and so on. I think I will. This is first in my list now. What kind of music are you talking about? Because, of course, there is heavy metal and there is music. Well, I don't like heavy metal. And I am an opera fan, and I have opera all the time in the background. Have you discussed what type of music could be?
That's a great question. Yes. I think the closest answer is it should be music that is culturally. If you're working with a client or a patient, music that they are familiar with. I just recently reviewed a study from Latin America. They had used salsa music with an old. With a dementia patient, and she was able to recognize the tunes and the lyrics, which was very encouraging. Yes, it should be music that the person likes and wants to hear. Music of your own culture, music that is familiar. Is that what you were?
Yes. I was curious. Yeah. Thank you, Lola.
Thanks very much, Lola. Can I ask a quick last question? I mean, if music has that kind of protective function in the case of the aging brain, what does that tell us about the importance of music in young kids as they grow up and are forming their sort of their habits of processing in the brain?
Oh, that is a very, very prominent and contentious question now. It's obviously very important, but that doesn't answer your question. There are problems, I think, with a lot of the research in that area, is that the research has not necessarily been very well done. So I can't give you any definite answers here. But I think that generally speaking, that the music lessons are encouraged, but they always were. So, we need more new evidence. It's the other side of the coin from what we've been doing. We've been working at this part of the end of life. Now there are other people that focus on the beginning, and the music educators. We need more evidence there.
Thanks, Lola. Well, let's move on then to Michael Cunningham from Chemical Engineering. Michael.
Thank you, Patrick. I co-authored a book last year with Philip Jessup, who's also on that call, and waving. And we're each going to speak briefly about it. I think it would make more sense, Patrick, if we went together. So okay. I can wait till Philip goes, or he can jump the queue and speak.
We'll jump Philip up the queue. So why don't we start with you, Michael, and we'll bring.
Well, actually, Philip and I had arranged. We're going to speak about different parts. So, Philip, are you ready to lead off, and then I'll take on after you?
All right. So I wrote the first half of the book. Michael wrote the second half of the book. So it probably makes sense more with this order. This is the book. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's CO2 Switchable Materials. And let me give you an idea of what that means. First, switchable materials. What's a switchable material? So I have something here that you guys are probably very familiar with. It's called a flashlight. So you can turn it on. And there's a button which allows you to turn it back off again. You guys are familiar with flashlights, I'm sure. Now imagine if it wasn't switchable. Imagine if you could not turn it off. If it was always on. You could still use it to find your way in the dark, but it would burn up the energy, it'd burn up the batteries. You have to replace the batteries every day. It would waste energy, waste materials. And so that problem exists in industry as well. So in the chemical industry and in lots of other industries, you've got lots of materials which are not switchable. Solvents, surfaces, catalysts, all sorts of different things are not switchable. And that means that we have wastage of energy and wastage of materials. And so what we've tried to do is develop ways of making those non-switchable things switchable. Okay, so that's what I mean by, or we both mean by switchable materials. And for example, let's just suppose you're a chemical industry, you're doing an extraction. Now you guys may not be, used to chemical industry, but you do extractions all the time. Have you ever dipped a tea bag into hot water? Okay, you dip the tea bag into the hot water and brown chemicals come out of the tea into your hot water, making the drink you're hoping to drink, all right? And the stuff you don't want stays in the tea bag. And when you pull tea bag away and throw it away, those chemicals are gone. That's an extraction. So industry does this on a huge scale all the time. They don't always use hot water. They may use other solvents, but the idea is the same. Now, supposing they don't want to drink it, supposing they want those chemicals that are now in the hot water, and they don't want them in hot water, they want them out so they can sell them or whatever, okay? You chose hot water because it dissolves those chemicals well. And so the first part of your extraction works great. The next part of your extraction, you got to get those chemicals out of the hot water. And that's where you run into trouble. Hot water keeps those chemicals dissolved. It doesn't let them go. So you need a solvent that's switchable. So you can have it dissolve the chemicals during the first part. And then when you want to you throw the tea bag away and you want the chemicals out, you switch the solvent so it no longer dissolves those chemicals and they come out and you can collect them. So that's why we need solvents to be switchable. Surfactants, surfaces, windows, we need all sorts of things to be switchable, and we save money, energy, and materials and make things greener. And so we've done all sorts of different materials, Michael and I, over the years, and now it's a huge field. We use CO2 as a trigger. We don't, there's no, solvents don't have a button like a flashlight does. So you can't push the button to make it switch off. So we have to do something else. Now, chemicals like solvents react to light sometimes. They like the voltage, but light won't work if the material is opaque. Voltage won't work if the material doesn't conduct electricity. So we don't want to use toxic chemicals either. We needed something that's easy to add, easy to take away, and doesn't hurt people. And that is carbon dioxide. Mm. So we carbonate things like Coca-Cola. It's just carbonating the liquid by bubbling CO2 gas at 1 atmosphere, no pressure, anything, no temperature, higher temperature required. That's it. And then you let it get exposed to air to make the pop go flat, the CO2 go away, and it switches back. And so you can make our material switch back and forth between two different versions that behave differently whenever you want. And that way we make the whole world a lot greener.
Fascinating.
So okay, I'll just maybe pick it on from there, and then people can ask questions if they have any. Philip and I obviously do a lot of fundamental science, and most of what we publish is of a fundamental chemistry nature. But we're also big believers that if science is going to have real value, it needs to impact society in a meaningful way. So we've also looked at a number of applications over the years, water treatment being one, but one that's really caught our interest and interest of a lot of people is something we call switchable coatings or switchable paints. So you think about any of your protective coatings you apply to all sorts of surfaces. These are widely applied, so much more than people ever think is out there. And maybe most of this crowd is old enough to remember the oil-based or alkyd-based coatings and paints. Really strong smell, toxic.
Never dry.
Very hazardous solvents. And if you paint inside, it takes days to get the smell out. What those are polymers or synthetic molecules like plastics that are dissolved in an organic solvent. And you put them down on whatever surface you want. And the way they work is the solvent evaporates into the air, which is really bad. Big smog hazard, hazardous toxic materials, but it's up there in the air. Gives you a beautiful coating. Hard, smooth, repels water, but you've got this huge toxicity issue. The latex paints, which are also probably more familiar with, are water-based, but they work very differently, and they're not as good, frankly. They're made up of little soft polymer or plastic particles suspended in water. And the way they work is that you put your material down on whatever you're gonna coat, the water evaporates and the particles stick together. But the problem is they never stick together perfectly. Your gloss is bad. They're always moisture sensitive. And so what that means and the big picture for industry is that still about half of all coatings out there use organic solvents. In our houses, we use water-based paints, but in most industries, they use all these solvents. And it's a huge source of environmental pollution. So Philip and I have designed a polymer material, a switchable polymer that's really remarkable. It combines the best of both the oil-based and the water-based coatings. So we take one of these polymers and it actually fully dissolves in carbonated water, soda water, like what you get from a soda stream. But when you put it down on a substrate, much like happens when your club soda goes flat, the water evaporates, the carbon dioxide evaporates, and the polymer completely switches. It goes from being completely water soluble to completely hydrophobic or water repellent. And it gives these beautiful, hard, smooth coatings, completely insoluble in water or even vinegar or mild acids, like if you had acid rain. So we're really excited about this. There's a big company we're working with in France right now who's very interested in picking this up. And we're hopeful it's going to go somewhere because it could make a big impact on globally on reducing environmental contaminants from the use of solvents.
Oh, it's fantastic. How exciting. That's great. Questions for Michael and Phil? Before you got going, I was going to ask, so to a crude layperson's thinking about this kind of thing, I mean, one of the ways, would I be right in saying, a crude way of regulating if you don't have switchable materials, the way you regulate the reaction you're wanting is through the amount and the time of exposure, right? Back to Phil's tea bag. So what's beautiful about your new material, right, is that it runs its course and then it transforms itself on the surface, right?
Yeah.
Am I getting in a really crude way? Am I sort of in the right ballpark?
No, that's essentially right, Patrick. Literally, as the water that it's in evaporates, the nature of the polymer itself, the material, completely changes. So you have essentially an oil-based or a solvent-based coating where the solvent is carbonated water.
Wow.
And carbonated water is so much better for the environment than organic solvents. In fact, if you look at the human usage of organic solvents in the entire world, 45%, the largest piece of the pie, is in paints and coatings. And so if we can solve that so they can now use carbonated water instead, that means almost half the environmental harm of organic solvents in the world has gone away.
Amazing. Congratulations. It's fabulous work.
Patrick, can I make one last comment? Just on something I would like to get to do if I was here in person, and I hope I'm not going to embarrass her. If we were all having drinks together, I would introduce myself to Kate Harkness. Kate was my oldest daughter's PhD supervisor, and Simone defended last July. So Kate, I knew we were going to meet at some point on the campus. I didn't think it would be like this. So pleasure to virtually meet you, and I hope that we get to share a drink in the not too distant future. Maybe Simone will have a live graduation after her internship.
Yeah, thanks for the shout out. I've heard a lot about you over the last several years, so it's great to finally meet you. Great work.
Thank you.
Great to see you two connect. Well, thanks, Michael and Phil. Why don't we go to Anne Ellis from the School of Medicine?
Great, thank you. So now for something completely different. I'm Dr. Anne Ellis. I'm chair of the Division of Allergy and Immunology here in the Department of Medicine at the University. And if I get up permission to share my screen, I'll just show you a picture of my textbook, which I literally just took and then put it up on my screen for you. So this is a practical guide to the management and understanding of anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis is the most severe allergic reaction that you can experience. Common triggers include food and stinging insect reactions. I think this is this topic is near and dear to the previous principal's heart because we had the unfortunate death of a first-year student here on campus due to a food-induced anaphylactic reaction, and I helped consult with him on new policies around food safety on campus as a result of that, and that was a real pleasure to be involved in. The reason why I'm very proud of this textbook, I'm the chief editor, but I'm also a co-author of 3 of the chapters. But because I was chosen as editor, I was able to really put a lot of Canadiana into this textbook. So more than half of the chapters actually have Canadian authors and other Canadian allergists contributed. But we have expertise from across North America. It's very thin. There's only 10 chapters. I'll stop sharing my screen so I can show you one in real life. So you can see it's quite small, and it's something that is easily distributed to trainees and other people who are interested in learning more about what do I really need to know about anaphylaxis without it being a heavy tome to get through. So I'll keep it short and sweet. I'm actually very good at the 3-minute thesis, so I think I'm a little bit ahead of time. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. That's great. And hugely important. I was in a discussion just recently about how we make the campus safe for people who aren't normally part of it. You know, you can alert people to the dangers of severe allergies on campus and have good practices, but how you get the message across to people who are coming onto campus, either with a vulnerability to severe allergies, or the potential to contribute to some kind of incident, it's a really it's a real and live issue we've been talking about lately. So, any questions for Anne?
I have a question. Is the popular perception that these are being diagnosed more true, or my nephew has this, and it seems like I meet a student that cleans every other week that has these problems. Is this being diagnosed more, or is it?
Yeah, so again, I have a very close relationship with the emergency department. It helped that I did my internal medicine training here, and I was always a very polite senior resident to my emergency medicine colleagues. So I've been able to present to them on numerous occasions about this and other topics. And they're very good. We are, at least I should say, our emergency department is very good at recognizing when this is actually anaphylaxis as opposed to just an allergic reaction. And we're very good at managing it now compared to when I was doing my training several years ago. And it is more common. The CHI data has shown that nationally, the incidence of and prevalence of anaphylaxis has increased. And this is secondary mainly to the second wave of the allergy epidemic that we faced leading up to culmination and plateauing in the late 90s for things like allergic rhinitis and asthma. We're increasing at an exponential rate and then finally leveled off. But now we're seeing a second wave where food allergy is continuing to rise at an unsustainable rate, which we're finally slowing because of important studies like the LEAP study, which showed that early introduction of peanut will actually help reduce your risk of developing peanut allergy. So we are slowing that down, but definitely more true cases of anaphylaxis and also in general better management.
Thanks very much, Anne. And congratulations on the book too.
Thank you.
Let's move on to David Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Principal. I'm Dave Gordon, a professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning in our Department of Geography and Planning, and I'm proud to introduce Planning Canadian Communities, an introduction to the principles, practices, and participants in the 21st century. The book's published by Nelson out of Toronto in 2020, and here's part of the on-campus website. My co-authors are the late Gerald Hodge, Professor Emeritus of Planning at Queen's and my teacher, and Professor Pamela Shaw, the Director of the Community Planning Program at Vancouver Island University on the West Coast. Some fun facts about the book. This is its 7th edition. It's used in, at the moment, over 23 universities across Canada, and also in the professional education courses for urban planning and engineering across the country. So the book's used both for students and professional practice. In a recent poll of practicing professional planners, it was ranked the most influential Canadian book. So we're really proud of that. Just behind Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities. The 6th edition, which is here, received the Canadian Institute of Planners National Planning Award for in 2014-2015, and this edition, we're very proud, has been nominated for the same award for its coverage of planning with Indigenous peoples and First Nations, which we hope will help with the university's current priorities. The first edition of the book, this one, was caused by angry students, including me, demanding that our professors assign Canadian books about Canadian cities. In the early years of the school, the profs who'd all got their doctorates at American and British and French universities were prescribing American and British books and telling us that Canadian cities are exactly the same as Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, and it's just 10 years later we're going to be having the same problem, so we might as well study them. We disagreed, Gerald disagreed, and he wrote this first book. So when I came back to Canada 25 years ago to become a prof at Queen's, Gerald put the arm on me to become the lead author of the book. That was a great honor, and as we all know, you can't refuse a request from your former teacher, an offer that can't be refused. The book will be the core text in our new course on, I'll stop sharing here. It'll be the core text in our new course on Geography 230, an introduction to urban and regional planning. It's a no prereq course for broad use across the campus, and a foundation in our new certificate in urban planning studies, which is attracting students. So we're looking forward to future use. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. Congratulations on that. Remarkable achievement going into a 7th edition. It's fantastic. Questions for Dave?
Uh-oh, everybody's an urban planner.
It's remarkable to have been in on the ground for initiating this book, and now to be shepherding it through for subsequent generations. Remarkable. Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right. So if there are no further questions for Dave, let's move to Kate Harkness.
All right. Thanks very much. So this is my book. I don't know if you can see it. It's an edited volume, Stress and Mental Health. It's part of the Oxbook Library of Psychology. I co-edited this with my very close colleague, Elizabeth Hayden at Western. And it is 33 chapters. So we assembled all of our friends in the field, internationally renowned experts, to provide in really one authoritative work, an overview of the most cutting edge theory and research on the role of stress in mental health. And this is important, as many of you probably know. About 1 billion people worldwide suffer from a mental health or substance use disorder. And the global economic costs of mental disorders have been estimated at $16 trillion per year. This is actually higher than the costs associated with all other disorders, including cardiovascular disease. And stress has been implicated as a causal factor in every single psychiatric disorder. Now, when I used to fly on planes and when I used to go to parties, people would usually ask me, what do you do? And I'd say, well, I study the role of stress in mental health. And they'd kind of look at me like, well, don't we already know that? I'm like, duh. So you might wonder, or they might wonder, why we need an entire huge volume on the relation of stress and mental health. And that's because there are a lot of intriguing questions. So for example, which stress exposures most strongly predict the onset of psychiatric disorders? And do different types of stressors predict different types of disorders? So for example, in depression, stressful life events with themes of interpersonal loss or rejection more strongly trigger onset than other sorts of events. And even within bipolar disorder, completely different types of stressful events predict manic episodes than predict depressive episodes. There are also lots of questions related to the mechanisms that translate stress into mental health. So stress changes us, just as we're changed by all of our experiences, and we can see these changes at multiple levels. So at the psychological level, for example, trauma, stress in childhood fundamentally shapes in negative ways the way we think about ourselves, others, in the world. And really fascinating work by people like Katie McLaughlin, and we've done some of this work actually. Mike's daughter Simone has done some of this work, that different types of childhood trauma actually will result in different core beliefs about the self. At the biological level, this was actually the sort of stuff that got me really interested in this field 25 years ago. We can actually see stress in the brain. So even stress that doesn't create any physical trauma, so psychological stress, we can actually see on brain scans. So it causes the release of toxic hormones that destroy cells in particular parts of the brain. And then at an even more impactful level, stress can change the epigenome and be transmitted across generations in a population. And when we integrate this sort of genetic research with some of the crucial work that's being done on the role of social systems in reinforcing stressful conditions like social disenfranchisement and racism, we can really start to understand how trauma experienced decades or even centuries ago can have effects right now in raising people's risk for mental illness and substance use. And more broadly, integrating stress mechanisms across all of these levels, as we've done here with these authors, helps us to understand who may be most vulnerable to the effects of stress. And in the final section of this book, we talk about translating this basic research into action. So what works, and even more critically, what doesn't work in promoting resilience to stress. Now, we finished this book before the pandemic, but I would argue that it has never been more important to understand the critical role of stress in shaping our psychology and biology than now, when our whole world is undergoing a chronic, unpredictable, and uncontrollable stressor, the worst kind of stressor. Now, humans as a whole are actually very resilient. We've shown this throughout our evolution, but advances that the experts in this book and we in our lab have been doing will hopefully be taken up by governments, institutions, and even individuals at this critical time to ensure that we emerge from this time with a strong commitment to promoting mental health. We really think that's key to ensuring a healthy society in the future. So thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Kate. Really, really interesting work, especially during the time of COVID. I'm reminded of Jill Horton's new book on the stress of the current situation. So would it be true to say there's a heightened degree of awareness of stress in the population because of COVID? I mean, presumably there's more stress, but more people dwelling on their own mental state in an interesting way. I mean, that's just an amateur observation, but would that be true, do you think?
Yeah, I think that is definitely true. So I wrote a piece for The Conversation back in the fall, and the amount of media attention I got and personal attention, people just emailing me directly about the issue. So it was a piece, it was actually talking about how COVID stress gets under the skin. So people have been complaining of, you know, my scalp's itchy, you know, I'm breaking out into hives, you know, all of these horrible things, what's going on? So talking about how stress can manifest in these ways that we wouldn't think that it would. And, you know, I mean, you know, talked to NPR, I talked to Sanjay Gupta, you know, I've never had so much, you know, attention by famous people as talking about stress and COVID. So it is something that people are really, there's definitely a heightened awareness of it across the board. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned some things that don't work. Could you just share with us one of those things that do not work with reference to stress management?
Yeah, so one of the it's actually now kind of a famous example, but you might have heard of critical incident stress debriefing, or CISD. And it's actually used a lot in you know, first responders. And it's a strategy to help people who just encountered a traumatic event in processing that trauma right away as a way to hopefully prevent the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. That has actually been found in general populations to be harmful, not helpful. And it's quite striking that it was implemented very widely because there was this intuitive sense. It had a lot of face validity. And so it was broadly disseminated without really any research done on it. And when they finally did the research, they found that it actually, people who underwent critical incident stress debriefing had higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than if they had not.
Thanks for the question, Babette. Claudia, you had a question.
Well, yeah, maybe if we have time, I don't know.
Go ahead.
It's a difficult question. I think so. Maybe you can answer this in 30 seconds or 10 seconds. But the idea of a stress passing from one generation to the other, not at the cultural level, no, not from parents that are stressed to their kids that see their parents stressed, but at the physical level. Could you explain very quickly, like, because that's surprising, no? That's, I think that one of the things that we haven't understand well, no, the fact that the stress can pass at the physical level. If you can comment very quickly on that.
And it's a really fascinating emerging area that I am not an expert on. So we do have a chapter on it written by one of the leading world experts on that area, but it's a very complicated area, the area of epigenetics. And it's the idea that, you know, we're born with our DNA, but there are also, you know, those genetic markers and the proteins that get encoded that lead to behavior and that sort of thing can actually change over time based on our experiences. And so they can change within a person based on their experiences, but they can also then kind of, and again, this is a very dumbed down way of explaining it because I am not an expert, but it's kind of like the way that we have changed, we then pass that change on genetically to our offspring. So I'm afraid I can't give you much more than that. Maybe there's somebody else on the call here who is a genetics expert, but there really is this evidence that not only, you're right, so not only in a sociocultural way, the memories and the stories, but at this kind of fundamental biological way, we're passing on those experiences.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for the question, Claudia. George, why don't we go to you? Well, I think you're still muted, George. There you go.
Let me know. Can you hear me all right now?
Yep.
Well, thanks again for the invitation, and good to hear about all these wonderful books out there now. This time last year, I was presenting this book, basically.
Atemorizar la tierra.
You remember, Atemorizar la tierra. So basically, there's three editions of this book in Spanish. A bestseller in Guatemala. I mean, I don't know how many copies you need, but there you have it. But it's now come out in English, so I don't think you can get any better than those three words in Spanish to sum up the book, Atemorizar la tierra. But we've translated it as Strike Fear in the Land. So, as with Atemorizar la tierra, I have Christopher Lutz and Wendy Kramer, two long-standing colleagues, as co-authors. And basically, it's a nice University of Oklahoma press book. They have a series on indigenous peoples, which it's part of. So let me just say, of course, the book has an obligatory subtitle, Pedro de Alvarado and the Conquest of Guatemala, 1520 to 1541. And that's Don Pedro himself on the cover there. So oftentimes people ask, there's not been many occasions to launch the book. This being one of the few. But people ask where we got the title from. And those three words, Atemorizar la tierra, are actually from, as it were, the horse's mouth. Those are Don Pedro's words himself. So when he was in Guatemala undertaking the conquest, he wrote to his commanding officer in Mexico, Hernán Cortés, saying, I sent word to indigenous allies called the Caciqueles, ordering and demanding of them in His Majesty's name to send warriors to fight alongside me, not only to test their goodwill, but to strike fear in the land. So you get it from him what he wanted to do. So that indigenous element is very, very important because while still he's obviously a conqueror of Guatemala, but all too often Alvarado is considered the one and only conqueror of Guatemala. And what we try to do in Strike Fear in the Land is make sure that people know that he couldn't, like most Spanish conquests, have accomplished anything had it not been for indigenous allies siding with the Spaniards in their campaigns of conquest. And one of the groups who came down from Mexico with him to undertake the conquest of Mexico, there was no love lost between some of the Maya peoples in between themselves, but certainly not with any of the indigenous peoples. The Aztecs, for instance, were conquering the Maya of Guatemala at the same time as, well, Alvarado arrived and took over. But we've been talking about archives and sources. And most of the sources for this book from the archives in Guatemala, but most of them come from the Archivo General de Indias in Sevilla.
In Sevilla.
But I came across in my old alma mater, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from Glasgow. And in Glasgow, in special collections there, there's an Historia de Tlaxcala, and I'll show you this. Basically, what the history has is a series of battle scenes depicting confrontation by confrontation. It's like a geography of conquest of Guatemala, in which the Tlaxcalan allies show themselves place by place, confrontation by confrontation in Alvarado's side of the conquest. It's an interesting thing to find the Historia de Tlaxcala there in special collections in Glasgow. We know that the Tlaxcalans themselves, when they came to Spain, they to make sure that they were recognized as being conquerors of Guatemala and wanted rewards for that. They brought a history of Tlaxcala with them. So you're talking mid-16th century, a little bit later. So they gifted a copy to Philip II. And we know that the copy that's now in Glasgow was gifted to Philip II and was actually in his library, the famous library in El Escorial, outside of Madrid. How Sir William Hunter got hold of Philip II's copy of the Historia Tlaxcala for me to get these lovely illustrations from, I've still got to get some kind of satisfaction on that side of the story. But it was pilfered in some way. But it's well looked after in Glasgow and really has helped, I think, give this book, as others don't have, an indigenous element to the conquest. So that's it. Thanks very much for your attention. And soon to be a major motion picture? I don't think so. But with any luck, the book will be as well received in English as its Spanish counterpart has been.
Thanks, George. Congratulations. In the interest of time, I'm going to control my desire to ask questions, of which there would be many. So maybe if I could just move us on. Kyle, I jumped over you in my hitherto rigorously alphabetical list. So why don't we go to you now? This is Kyle Johansen from philosophy.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, that's right. My name's Kyle Johansen. I'm a Queen's alumnus, actually. I did my PhD in the Department of Philosophy at Queen's. And this past year, I taught as an adjunct in the department. And I'm also a member of the Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics research group at Queen's, a research group convened by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka.
Wow.
The book that I wrote and published recently, this is it right here. It's called The Moral and Political Problem of Wild Animal Suffering, and it was published with Routledge. And so this book is about, the topic of the book is wild animal suffering. This topic's been receiving increasingly large amount of attention, I'm happy to say, in different places lately. And that's a relatively recent occurrence. And so, if you're interested in sort of checking it out, some YouTube influencers have been talking about this topic, particularly the influencers Humane Hancock and Cosmic Skeptic, if you want to look up those names. And it's also been receiving a decent amount of attention from members of the effective altruism movement, which you can also look up if you want to. And in particular, the effective altruist organizations that have decided to really prioritize wild animal suffering are a group called Animal Ethics, a group called Wild Animal Initiative, and a group called Rethink Priorities. Anyways, so if you just want to know what the basic problem is here, the idea with wild animal suffering is that if you take a close look at the sorts of lives that individual wild animals are typically living, and in particular, a look at the implications of population dynamics for the lives that individual wild animals are living, it turns out that wild animals are living much worse lives than it would seem at first glance. And the reason basically is that many animal species protect their genes by producing very large numbers of offspring rather than by producing small numbers of offspring that they intensively care for. So it's very common across many types of animals, across small mammals, across lizards, across amphibians, across fish, to just produce large numbers of offspring and devote a very small amount of energy into each individual offspring. The idea being that many of your offspring will perish, but some, if you just have enough of them, will probably live, survive to maturity, and then manage to reproduce. If you're just looking at this from an ecological standpoint, it looks fine. It seems to be an effective way for species to stay in existence and for animals to pass on their genes successfully. But if you take a look at it from an ethical perspective, where we're focused on the moral significance of sentience, it looks morally atrocious, and it seems to be an implication of this means of protecting genes that the vast majority of sentient individuals born into the world are living these really terrible lives, and it's really quite disturbing. And so what my book does is it takes this problem seriously, this fact about wild animals' lives, and looks at what I think the moral implications of it are. And I think that there's at least two major moral implications. And one is that it seems like there's a pretty strong case for humanitarian intervention in nature, for us to be trying to research effective ways of increasing the average level of welfare in ecosystems. And I think the other major implication probably is that we should be rethinking some of the conservation practices that are common in ecology and conservation biology. So for example, when people are engaging in rewilding, they tend not to think very much about the welfare levels in the ecosystems that will emerge after rewilding projects are carried out. But we should be thinking about that, especially because we're actually causally and morally responsible for the welfare of the animals that come into existence after a rewilding project is carried out. And we should, be favoring ecosystems where wild animals will be living good lives rather than ecosystems where they live really bad lives. I think some research into that would be really good. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Oh, thanks very much. I do want to move us on, but any quick questions for Kyle?
I had a quick one.
Yeah.
Does that mean that, nature got it wrong and we are morally superior to nature?
Yeah, thanks for the question. In one sense, I think the question presupposes something about nature that is false. So I think the question makes it sound like nature is a kind of agent that's capable of making right or wrong decisions. I think nature is just, it's a bunch of forces that, there's some regularity to the way those forces work, but there's nothing like a god that, at least, this is a sort of modern contemporary perspective on nature, right? There's nothing like a god that's making decisions about which kind of things will come into existence and whether they'll live good lives or not. But I mean, just to answer the question, yeah, I mean, nature is producing ecosystems with very, very low levels of welfare. And yeah, we've actually accomplished something very significant by raising our level of welfare to a much higher point by successfully challenging things like disease, the weather we would normally have to encounter. We protect ourselves from weather events. We tend now to restrict reproduction to small numbers of children who we spend a lot of effort caring for. And so, infant mortality is way lower now in human populations than it used to be. These are all really significant accomplishments, and they're all deviations from nature too. So yeah, I think kind of.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks for the question, Phil. I hope everybody's okay to stick around for another 15 minutes or so, because I want to make sure we hear from everybody. And I've managed the time poorly, so my apologies to you for that. It's just too interesting. So I'll move us along, and I did want to also acknowledge Michael Vandenberg, who's here, and to acknowledge Michael for his service as interim vice provost and university librarian. So Michael, just thank you very much for all of that. Thanks for all the support you have given through your work to our researchers and scholars here at Queen's. I ought to have acknowledged you right at the start, but thanks for being here.
Well, thanks, Patrick. And I guess I would just observe that as far as I know, these are not the only 22 monographs that were written in the last year. And of course, one of our challenges in the library, despite all of the rich and complex systems that we have in place for tracking and providing access to scholarly outputs, is to maintain that awareness of what is being published and what work is being done in the university. And it's fantastic to have an opportunity like this to hear about some of those works in more depth. But I would certainly thank you all for making us aware of your new publications, and encourage you within your departments to raise awareness for the role that the library plays in providing access to those, and where possible to give thoughtful consideration to the places that you publish to increase the equitable access to scholarly output of the university. Many of our publishers have a strong focus on very Western and European centered education institutions, and one of our great goals in the library is to be a leveler and to build connections across the academy globally to create something of a global knowledge commons. So I would really encourage you to think about that and take that into account as you begin work on your next publications.
Thanks, Michael. I should ask, so if people are willing to stick around, that's great. Is anybody who has yet to speak under pressure of time? Because I can, please, yeah. Gabriel, you were going to be next anyway, so why don't we start with you? How about, is everybody else okay for 15 minutes more or so?
Yeah.
Good. All right. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Well, hello, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's quite a pleasure to be here. My name is Gabriel. I'm an assistant professor at Film and Media. This is, well, sorry about that. Now, am I back? Yes.
Ironic, his green screen ate him.
Yeah. I'm really sorry about that, people. Well, this is the book that I launched last year. It was co-edited with my colleague Virginia Crisp from King's College London. It's the fourth in a series with, not really a series, but the fourth that has been organized by us in the context of the Besides the Screen network, which is a network concerned with, well, film studies within the wider perspective of media studies. So instead of focusing on the film text, more on the practices and the technologies surrounding film and surrounding moving images. It's called Practice of Projection, Histories and Technologies. It has 15 chapters with authors from Europe and all over the Americas, covering case studies on, well, video mapping, improvised exhibition, solar-powered cinema, film projection in sacred sites, magic lanterns, audiovisual performances, projections between exhibition and information, and yeah, a lot of other different case studies. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel. Any questions for Gabriel?
I've got one.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Did you touch on Montreal en Histoire? That, you know, there was this wonderful media projection extravaganza in Old Montreal over the last few years, where you're walking around Old Montreal in the evening and your iPhone triggers projections onto the actual spaces where things like the burning of the Canadian Parliament happened.
Oh, I didn't know that. I mean, I know a lot of work from Toronto, especially in the field of media facades, the Nuit Blanche, and even in Montreal. We don't have specific chapters about that in the book. We have a chapter by a group from Concordia University called Elastic 3D Spaces, but they are working mostly with stereographic projection and VR.
Thanks, Dave, for the question. Let's move on to Ram then. Thanks, Gabriel.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. So I'm a professor of mathematics in the Queen's, and my book is a second course in analysis. Now I should explain the title because analysis tends to evoke psychological themes. And in fact, there is a chapter called Complex Analysis, and has nothing to do with psychology. It's all mathematics. Let me share the most colorful page in my book, if I may. The most colorful page in my book is this. Everybody can see that.
There we go.
So, analysis refers to study of functions of several variables that keep changing. And the variables are interdependent. They're connected to one another. So this is an example. How do you see these functions that keep changing? Example, if you wanted to study the virus, the susceptible people, the infected people, the rate at which recovery is happening, and all these equations. And in order to study that, you need to have a good knowledge of multivariable calculus. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and get back so everybody can perhaps see me. So this book is really a graduate course that we target our PhD students. So that's why it's called a second course. It's not an undergraduate book. It's a second course, meaning you've had your undergraduate material. Now you're ready to do a PhD, so you have to do that. So this is the idea of the book. For this audience, I want to say a few words about the cover. This book is published by the Institute for Mathematical Sciences, which is a think tank in Chennai, southern India. And one of the things they asked me for a potential cover, and I suggested a banana leaf because I was always intrigued by the fact that people in South India eat meals off a banana leaf. They take a banana leaf and they wash the banana leaf, and you can actually use it as a plate. And I was intrigued by the fact that meals are served on banana leaves. And I thought I would serve my mathematical meal. And it's actually, that's what it is. These are the water droplets on a banana leaf. Yes, that's it.
Thanks, Ram. A delicious meal, I'm sure. Thank you. Thanks. Any questions for Ram about the second course? All right. Thanks, Ram. Claudia.
Okay, so I'm going to be very brief, to stick to the 3 minutes out of respect for everybody. So my book is called The Speciality of the Hispanic Avant-Garde. It was published last year by Brill Rodopy in the Netherlands and in Boston. And as part of the Critical Avant-Garde Studies series. So the book continues along an ongoing discussion in Hispanic studies, which is this conflicting juxtaposition of localism and cosmopolitanism, of tradition and modernity. The book approaches this conflict from the critical perspective of speciality, and it applies it to the work of two avant-garde movements in the 1920s, Mexican Estridentismo, and Spanish ultraism, ultraísmo. And the central discussion of the book explores how place, understood as dwelling, nation, identity, and attachment, conflict with space, understood as this temptation of movement, change, and cultural freedom. No, it has 4 chapters, each focusing on a location that was relevant to the vanguard. So the first chapter is called Cities, and in it I explore Mexico City and Madrid, but also this imaginary city, this abstract city that has no actual spatial reference. The second chapter is called Cafés, and it deals with these locations where the literary gatherings took place, and that I explore as thresholds between body and imagination, and between the interior and exterior spaces of the city. The third chapter is called Mobile Spaces, so means of transportation, cars, planes, tramways, and transatlantic ships that are understood as these mobile locations of belonging. And finally, the last chapter is the ocean, this simultaneously modern and unmodern territory. So I mostly study visual works and poems. So the book is really, Braille did a very nice edition. So a lot of is very beautifully illustrated. You cannot see all the images here, but it is really full of images. And getting the rights for those images was really very difficult. So what the book argues, to conclude, is that turning places into spaces and vice versa is at the core of the Hispanic vanguard artistic production. In other words, that destabilizing, resignifying, and dehistoricizing the locations that through repetition and emotional bonding have become meaningful, while simultaneously transforming those distant territories into locations of affecting belonging, is what defines the work of the ultraístas and the estridentistas, poets and painters. Okay. And I think that's it, because we don't have any more time. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudio. Expertly summarized. So thanks. Really interesting book, I must say, in a field that I have a personal interest in. Thanks. So maybe we could move on. I think we have Colleen and Babette, and we lost Mark Walters, who sadly had to leave us for another meeting. But let's go to Colleen.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for organizing this wonderful event. It's been a bit of a lonely year in research and writing, as I'm sure we can all relate to. And this is really lovely. So my monograph, The Operatic Archive, American Opera as History, was published by Routledge in 2020. Here's the book cover. Oh, Rosa, I was so delighted to hear of your love of opera.
I am fanatic.
This is part of their Interdisciplinary Studies in Opera series, which is a sort of thriving, growing series in the collection. The book extends the growing interdisciplinary conversation in opera studies by drawing on new research in performance studies and the philosophy of history. And basically it moves beyond traditional conceptions, aesthetic conceptions of opera, to argue for opera's potential for historical impact and engagement in late 20th and early 21st century American operas. And so considering opera's ability to serve as a vehicle for memory, historical experience, affect, presence, and the historical sublime, the book demonstrates how opera's ability to not only represent but also animate historical events and historical experience, and how this differs from the representation of history in other modes, notably literary and dramatic modes. And music and theatrical performance, for example, have remarkable temporal and affective and memorializing potential. And opera offers unique access to the historical as a result. I explore ways that it can enliven historical experience through its ability to evoke an uncanny suspension between past and present because of music's capacity to do so. I include a chapter on how operas that thematize the PTSD of Afghanistan war vets can actually provide community healing through the experience of hearing trauma differently in these works. And finally, the stickiness of operatic voices and music and bodies on the stage means that history imprints itself upon the present in a profound way in these works. And I think in the interest of time, I will leave it at that, but I will just say that the image on the cover here is, I don't know if you can see that, it's a little bit sort of blurry, but this is an image from the Atlanta Opera production of a piece called To Remain by Jake Heggie, the American composer Jake Heggie, about Holocaust remembrance. And I love this image because it sort of juxtaposes the words on the back of the stage sort of projected there throughout the piece, and then the live performance of the piece in the space itself, which I write about in the book. So anyway, thank you so much. And congratulations to all of the rest of you. I've taken notes and look forward to reading some of these things.
Colleen, thanks very much. And congratulations to you too. Fascinating looking book. So Babette, should we go to you finally?
Thanks. Thank you for inviting me, everybody. And my name is Bernadette Resurrection. You can call me Babette. I'm from Global Development Studies. I just came to Kingston in the middle of the pandemic last October. So I'm fairly new at Queen's. And this is my book. Don't know if you can see it. It's called Negotiating Gender Expertise in Environment and Development. Now, what inspired this book is actually the growing numbers of gender experts in traditionally science-led programs and science-led organizations, largely as a result of global environment and development agreements. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Paris Agreement, for example, or way back Agenda 21 in 1992, or perhaps more recently, the Convention for Biodiversity, etc. And lo and behold, many of these programs, even up to the United Nations level, whether it be UNEP or the FAO, are now hiring and employing a lot of gender experts. So gender expertise is now being juxtaposed with traditionally technical expertise in these spaces. And it's not just the UN. We have, for instance, environment and development think tanks all over the world who are increasingly bringing in gender expertise within their rosters. So I felt that, this was something that sort of prompted the making of this book, and sort of asking, is it something that we celebrate, considering that it is a hard-won gain that feminist voices, gender expertise are now coming into the center stage in very technical environments? And is it a testament, for instance, to the victory of interdisciplinary collaborations and interfaces? So what we did in this book, it's about 14 chapters of conversations with different gender experts in different fields of energy, of climate change, and disasters, plant biodiversity, marine resources, water management, agriculture, and forestry. So there are gender experts in all these fields, very active. Now, yes, it is a moment for celebration, but it is also a moment for reflection, or what we call self-reflexivity, where we see that there are also inherent politics involved, what we refer to as differences on epistemologies, on one hand, more technical epistemologies, and of course, coming from the social sciences, more social science oriented epistemologies. So as a result, there are tensions that emerge from these, shall we say, partnerships. And one of our revelations in this book is that programs and organizations that are far more technical and yet have gender experts and are much more addressing the conventional, are actually practicing the much more conventional way of addressing environmental issues in technical ways, have a more difficult time of, shall we say, dismantling these hierarchies of knowledge. But we find that gender experts are themselves very agile. They actually cross certain barriers, certain what we call epistemological boundaries, allowing for some slippages that would enable wider spaces for conversations on gender equality in the context of environmental and climate change, especially involving power wielders as well as policymakers. So that's what the book is all about. Thank you.
Congratulations, Babette. Excellent, fascinating. Thanks so much. A really great summary. So everybody's apologies again for going over here, but we could have spent way longer because there's so much to talk about with all your work. But I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Keith Gabronski-McNitch from my office, who's organized this for us. Again, thanks to Michael for joining us. Thanks to all of you and congratulations again. This is one of my favorite moments in there, even if we're doing it this way and not hanging around at Benedictson House over some refreshments. It's really exciting to learn about the work that you've all been doing and to be able to celebrate your success with these various projects. So I'll leave you there and say thanks very much and good luck on the next projects, which are, I'm sure, well underway already. So we'll look forward to the results of those efforts. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Been a pleasure.
Patrick, all the best, everybody.